Jerusalem breathed with restless energy beneath the blazing afternoon sun. It was Passover season, the holiest time of the year, and the ancient city overflowed with pilgrims who had journeyed from distant corners of the Roman Empire. The narrow limestone streets echoed with the sounds of merchants bargaining, priests chanting prayers, and families preparing sacred meals behind crowded doorways. Smoke from burning incense drifted through the air, mixing with the scent of roasted lamb from the temple courts above the city. To most people, it seemed like an ordinary holy day filled with tradition, celebration, and devotion. Yet hidden beneath the noise of the bustling city, history itself was trembling on the edge of transformation. Just beyond Jerusalem's northern walls, on a barren hillside called Golgotha, the place of the skull, a very different scene was unfolding. 3 crosses stood against the darkening sky, surrounded by Roman soldiers and scattered crowds who had gathered to witness another public execution. But the man hanging on the middle cross was unlike any criminal Rome had ever condemned. His name was Jesus of Nazareth, the teacher who had healed the sick, raised the broken, and inspired hope among the forgotten people of Judea. For hours, he had endured agony beneath the crushing weight of the Roman cross, yet an unsettling calm still surrounded him. Few understood what was truly happening that afternoon. While the city carried on with its rituals and celebrations, the world was quietly approaching a moment that would divide history forever. As midday approached, the city of Jerusalem should have been glowing beneath the fierce brilliance of the Judean sun. Passover crowds still filled the streets, and life moved with the usual rhythm of celebration and ritual. Priests continued their duties within the temple courts, while merchants called out to travelers passing through the crowded marketplaces. Yet without warning, something impossible began to unfold above the city. The sunlight faded suddenly, not like the slow arrival of evening or the gathering of storm clouds, but as though the heavens themselves had been extinguished. Within moments, an unnatural darkness spread across the land, swallowing Jerusalem in a heavy shadow that sent waves of confusion through the streets. People stopped where they stood and looked upward in fear. Mothers pulled their children close. Conversations dissolved into anxious whispers. Even the animals seemed to sense that something beyond human understanding was taking place. This was no ordinary eclipse. Passover always occurred during a full moon, making such darkness scientifically impossible. The laws of nature themselves appeared suspended as the sky turned black in the middle of the day. For 3 agonizing hours, the darkness remained over the land like a funeral veil draped across creation itself. Outside the city walls, the silhouette of 3 crosses stood against the dim horizon, barely visible beneath the suffocating gloom. At the center hung Jesus of Nazareth, bruised and bleeding beneath the weight of humanity's sin. The darkness seemed to reflect the sorrow of heaven itself, as though the world could no longer bear to witness the suffering of the one who had brought light into it. Fear settled over Jerusalem like a living presence. No voice could explain what was happening, yet deep within their hearts, many understood that this was more than a tragedy. Something eternal was unfolding before their eyes, and the world would never be the same again. For hours, the darkness had hung over the land like a warning from heaven. Beneath the blackened sky, the air around Golgotha grew unbearably still, heavy with fear and grief. Roman soldiers stood uneasily beside the crosses, no longer mocking with the same confidence they had shown earlier in the day. The crowds that had once shouted in anger now watched in trembling silence, disturbed by the growing sense that they were witnessing something far greater than an ordinary execution. At the center of it all, Jesus of Nazareth struggled for each breath, his body weakened by exhaustion, blood loss, and unbearable pain. Yet even in his suffering, there remained a strange authority in his presence that no amount of violence could erase. Then suddenly, breaking through the suffocating silence, Jesus gathered his final strength and cried out with a voice that echoed across the rocky hills outside Jerusalem, "It is finished." The words rang through the darkness with power and certainty, not as the defeated whisper of a dying man, but as the declaration of a mission completed. and in the very moment his head fell and his spirit departed, the earth itself seemed to react. A violent tremor erupted beneath the ground without warning. The hill of Golgotha shook violently as massive cracks split through the stone beneath the crosses. Rocks shattered and tumbled down the hillside, while terrified screams echoed through the darkness. In Jerusalem, buildings trembled, walls groaned, and people were thrown to the ground in panic. The earthquake rolled across the land like a shockwave, tearing through creation itself. Men who had faced war without fear now struggled to stand as the earth convulsed beneath them. It felt as though nature itself could no longer remain silent at the death of its creator. In that terrifying moment, the foundations of the world seemed to break apart, marking the end of one age and the beginning of another. While the earth trembled beneath Jerusalem and terrified crowds struggled to comprehend the chaos unfolding around them, another miracle was taking place deep within the sacred walls of the temple. Inside the holy place, priests continued their evening rituals surrounded by the glow of golden lampstands and the rising fragrance of burning incense. For generations, this had been the center of Israel's worship, the place where humanity approached the presence of God through sacrifice and ceremony. Yet hidden behind the inner chambers of the temple stood a massive veil, unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. The curtain towered nearly 60 feet high and was woven from thick layers of richly colored fabric, so heavy that no ordinary man could tear it apart. Beyond it lay the Holy of Holies, the most sacred place in all of Israel, where the presence of God was believed to dwell. No one was permitted to enter except the high priest, and only once each year under strict ritual preparation. The veil stood as a constant reminder that sin had separated humanity from its creator. But at the very moment Jesus breathed his last upon the cross, a deafening sound ripped through the temple chambers. The enormous veil suddenly tore apart from top to bottom, as if an invisible hand from heaven itself had split it open. Priests froze in horror as the barrier that had stood for centuries collapsed before their eyes. In a single moment, everything changed. The separation between God and humanity had been broken. No longer would people need to stand at a distance in fear and ritual. Through the sacrifice of Christ, the way into the presence of God had been opened forever. What generations could never accomplish through law and sacrifice had now been completed on a cross outside the city walls. In the aftermath of the earthquake, the land surrounding Jerusalem bore deep scars where the earth itself had been torn open. Across the hillsides outside the city, ancient burial tombs cracked beneath the force of the violent tremors. Massive stone seals shifted from their places, exposing dark burial chambers that had remained untouched for generations. To those who witnessed it, the destruction already felt terrifying enough. Yet what would happen next would challenge every boundary between life and death. For a brief moment, the open tombs stood silent beneath the fading skies, as though creation itself was waiting for something still greater to come. Then, after the resurrection of Jesus on the third day, an astonishing miracle unfolded throughout Jerusalem. Many of the holy men and women who had died long before were raised from the grave. They emerged from their tombs alive and entered the city once more, appearing before countless witnesses who recognized them. Imagine the fear and wonder that spread through the streets as people came face to face with those they had mourned years earlier. These were not ghostly shadows or distant visions born from panic and grief. They were living testimonies that death itself had begun to lose its hold. Families saw familiar faces once believed forever buried beneath the earth. Conversations stopped. Crowds gathered in stunned silence. The impossible had become reality. The resurrection of these holy ones served as a powerful sign that something eternal had changed forever. The grave was no longer an unbreakable prison. Through the victory of Christ, even death had begun to surrender its power. Among the soldiers standing beneath the crosses that dark afternoon was a Roman centurion, a hardened officer whose life had been shaped by war, discipline, and death. Executions were nothing new to him. He had witnessed countless men beg for mercy, curse their enemies, or collapse in terror during their final moments. To Rome, crucifixion was simply another tool of power, designed to crush rebellion through fear and suffering. And at the beginning of that day, Jesus of Nazareth had appeared to be just another condemned prisoner, awaiting a brutal end. But as the hours passed beneath the unnatural darkness, the centurion began to realize that this execution was unlike anything he had ever seen. He watched Jesus endure unbearable agony without hatred or bitterness. Even while suffering on the cross, he spoke words of forgiveness instead of revenge. Then came the violent earthquake that shook the ground beneath their feet and sent fear through even the strongest soldiers. The sky, the earth, and the strange silence surrounding Golgotha all seemed to testify that something divine had taken place. As the tremors slowly faded and dust drifted through the cold afternoon air, the centurion looked up at the lifeless body hanging before him. In that moment, every certainty he had once trusted began to collapse. Overcome with fear and awe, he spoke words that would echo through history. Surely this was the Son of God. The confession of a Roman executioner became one of the first declarations of faith after the crucifixion, proving that even the hardest heart could be changed by what happened on that hill. As evening settled over Jerusalem and the chaos of the crucifixion slowly faded into silence, most of Jesus' followers remained hidden behind fear and grief. The crowds had dispersed, the soldiers had withdrawn from Golgotha, and the city prepared quietly for the approaching Sabbath. Yet while many mourned in secret, two unexpected men stepped forward with a courage that few others possessed. Their names were Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, respected members of the Jewish council who had quietly believed in Jesus long before his death. For months, they had followed him from a distance, afraid that public loyalty to Jesus would cost them their positions, reputations, and influence. But standing before the reality of the cross changed something within them. Fear no longer mattered. With the Roman authorities still controlling the city and tension hanging heavily in the air, Joseph boldly went to Pontius Pilate and requested permission to take the body of Jesus. It was a dangerous act that publicly identified him with the man Rome had executed. Alongside him came Nicodemus, carrying an extraordinary mixture of myrrh and aloes used for royal burials. Together, they carefully lowered the broken body of Jesus from the cross and wrapped him in clean linen cloths with great tenderness and honor. Every movement reflected deep sorrow mixed with reverence. Nearby, in a quiet garden, stood a newly carved tomb belonging to Joseph himself, untouched by any previous burial. There, beneath the fading light of the evening sky, they gently laid Jesus to rest. Though the world believed his story had ended in defeat, these two faithful men unknowingly prepared the resting place for the greatest victory history would ever witness. As night settled over Jerusalem, an uneasy tension lingered beneath the silence of the city. While the followers of Jesus mourned behind closed doors, the religious leaders remained restless despite what appeared to be their victory. They could not forget the strange words Jesus had spoken during his ministry, the promise that after 3 days he would rise again. Even in death, his presence continued to trouble them. Fearing that his disciples might attempt to steal the body and claim a resurrection, the chief priests and Pharisees went directly to Pontius Pilate. They demanded additional security around the tomb, determined to erase every possibility of hope surrounding the man they believed they had finally silenced. Pilate granted their request without hesitation. Soon, Roman soldiers marched through the darkness toward the garden tomb where Jesus had been laid. The massive stone covering the entrance was officially sealed with the authority of Rome itself. A cord was stretched across the rock and fastened with the governor's seal, making any attempt to disturb the grave an act punishable by death. Armed guards then took their positions outside the tomb, standing watch through the cold night air with strict orders to let no one enter. To the religious leaders, the matter was finished at last. The teacher from Nazareth was buried, guarded, and sealed behind stone and imperial power. The silence surrounding the tomb felt final, as though hope itself had been locked away inside the darkness. Yet, unknown to every soldier, priest and ruler in Jerusalem, heaven was already preparing for a moment that no earthly force would be able to stop. Before dawn on the third day, Jerusalem still rested beneath the quiet weight of grief and uncertainty. The streets remained silent after the long Sabbath, and the garden tomb where Jesus had been buried stood hidden in the pale shadows of early morning. Roman guards continued their watch outside the sealed entrance, believing their presence guaranteed that nothing inside the grave would ever change. The stone remained fixed in place beneath the authority of Rome, and to every earthly observer, death had won. But as the first light of morning began to rise beyond the hills of Judea, the ground suddenly trembled once again. A violent earthquake shook the garden with overwhelming force, startling the guards from their positions. Then, in a flash of heavenly brilliance brighter than the rising sun, an angel descended from heaven. His appearance burned like lightning against the darkness, and his garments shone white with a radiance no human words could fully describe. Fear swept through the soldiers instantly. These were trained men of war, hardened by battle and discipline, yet in the presence of the divine messenger, their strength collapsed completely. Trembling in terror, they fell to the ground like dead men. With effortless power, the angel approached the massive stone that sealed the tomb and rolled it aside, as though it weighed nothing at all. Yet the stone was not moved to release Jesus from the grave. By the time heaven touched the earth that morning, the tomb was already empty. Death itself had been conquered before the stone ever shifted from its place. Soon after sunrise, several women approached the garden carrying burial spices, their hearts still heavy with sorrow. But as they entered the tomb, they found only folded linen cloths resting where the body had once been laid. The silence inside the chamber felt holy and overwhelming. Then came the message that would change human history forever. He is not here. He has risen. In that single moment, despair gave way to hope. The sealed grave of Jesus Christ had become the birthplace of resurrection, proving that no darkness, no empire, and not even death itself could hold the Son of God. The resurrection of Jesus Christ became far more than a single miraculous event hidden within the pages of ancient history. It marked the moment hope broke through the darkness of the world forever. The empty tomb stood as undeniable proof that death, fear, and sin no longer held the final word over humanity. What began on a lonely cross outside Jerusalem ended with a victory powerful enough to transform countless lives across generations. For the followers of Jesus, everything changed after that morning. The fear that once kept them hidden behind locked doors was replaced with courage that would carry them across nations and empires. Men and women who had watched their teacher die in agony suddenly became witnesses to a risen Savior who had conquered the grave itself. Their message spread from Jerusalem to the ends of the earth, carrying the promise that forgiveness and eternal life were now available to all who believed. Even today, the story of the resurrection continues to speak into the deepest fears of the human heart. It reminds the broken that suffering is not the end. It reminds the hopeless that darkness never lasts forever. And it reminds every generation that no grave is powerful enough to imprison the one who overcame death itself. The stone was rolled away, the tomb was left empty, and history was changed forever. Because Jesus rose again, millions have found peace in moments of grief, strength in seasons of suffering, and hope beyond the limits of this life. The resurrection became the eternal symbol that light will always overcome darkness and life will always triumph over death. In the silence of that empty tomb, the world discovered a hope that could never be buried again.